The movie opens in a forest, where we see two sisters, a younger and an older one. They are having fun in a river together. It appears to be a story told by Lenny Walker, who resides with her eccentric grandmother, Graham, and her quirky uncle, Big. Graham and Big are standing beside the Lenny plant, which is not feeling so well. Graham, smiling, offers breakfast for Lenny and remarks that Lenny has someone else's sweater on. However, Lenny shortly leaves without saying anything about it. As Lenny leaves the house, we see that it has gotten dark outside in a matter of seconds. The soil seems to have changed, and something unnatural and eerie has happened to the environment. The next morning, Bailey, the older sister of Lenny, wakes Lenny up to ask which shirt she likes more, and Lenny, still sleepy and disgruntled by such a barbaric good morning, says that she doesn't care what Bailey wears. As we discover, this happens back in the past, and as Lenny clarifies, these were the last words she ever said to her sister. Bailey is shown playing in the theater, but unfortunately, she tragically collapses on the scene because of a fatal arrhythmia, just like their mother. Lenny is now resentful of the surrounding world because she is almost the only one mourning her sister, and everyone else seems to be living their normal life as if nothing has happened. We also see that Lenny was a skilled clarinet player. However, that changed once her sister tragically lost her life. Lenny comes back from the forest, where she was writing in her diary, and Graham points to the man who's doing some garden work, and her uncle Big, who's just sitting in the back of his car. Lenny and Uncle have a quick chat, but Lenny isn't really talkative and just passes by the man working in the garden, Bailey's ex-boyfriend, Toby. He remarks that Lenny has Bailey's sweater on, and Lenny says Graham wanted to pack away all of Bailey's stuff, but Lenny kept this sweater for herself. It seems that the chat is really hard for both of them, because Lenny is almost crying talking about Bailey. The next day, Lenny goes to school. Everyone is muttering and whispering as she walks through the hall. Here, we discover that Lenny missed around 2 months of school because of her sister's passing. However, Lenny isn't the only one who's being discussed. It appears a new boy from France came to school while Lenny was out. Lenny opens a door to the music class and we meet Joe, the French student, who is playing clarinet in there. Lenny imagines everyone is dropping on the floor in the hall because of Joe's perfect sense of rhythm and astounding skills with the clarinet. Back to the real world, Lenny finally enters the class and has a chance to meet with Joe. Joe says that the clarinet isn't really his thing and he shouldn't be here, and Lenny says she shouldn't either, and we're seeing the first spark in their relationship. Joe also says he's sorry for Lenny's tragic loss, and her face changes from smiling to grieving in a second, but she assures him that she's fine now. They are talking about solo play, and it seems they are both kind of afraid of playing it, so they jokingly decide where to run together, but are shortly interrupted by Lenny's Asian friend, Sarah. Once the lesson starts, the teacher greets Lenny, happy to have her back, and invites her to meet him after the class so he can help Lenny get back to music. Lenny says to her friend that she doesn't want to continue with music, but her friend only insists that she will do it one day. Meanwhile, Joe approaches Lenny again and says he will see her later. To the right of Lenny, we see another classmate, the red-haired Rachel, who's trying to offend Lenny by saying Joe is out of her league and she doesn't stand a chance to have him as her boyfriend. In the evening, all the family is sitting at the table for dinner. After the dinner, Lenny shows the video of her and Bailey to Bailey's boyfriend, Toby. As the two sisters are climbing to the house roof, Lenny is afraid of heights so she can't climb to where her sister is. Lenny enjoys watching those old moments, and Toby brings an old photo album, where we're seeing that the three of them were close back when Bailey was alive. Jokingly, Lenny says that she was plotting against Toby, as she was jealous of her sister, and Toby says his father wasn't happy about him and Bailey's relationship either. Lenny is in her room later on, when Graham joins her and finds the room in complete chaos. Graham says she has to stop wearing Bailey's clothes and waiting for her. However, Lenny is adamant about it and says one day, Bailey will come back, so she's waiting for her here. As Lenny navigates her emotional turmoil, she finds solace in two unexpected relationships. The next day, Lenny is playing her clarinet in a music lesson. Lenny is trying her best, however instead of music, some discordant noises leave her clarinet, resulting in a complete mess. After several tries, Lenny is disgruntled about the fact she can't play as well as she played before, and the music teacher decides to move on to the next track. Rachel is excited for the opportunity to rise, and she wants to challenge Lenny's chair. The teacher says it's not the time, however Lenny, having a long history of competitiveness with Rachel, accepts the challenge. Once the challenge starts, both girls are behind the curtain. Player B starts to play Mozart's Clarinet Concerto. The audience of the class really enjoys the melody, however when player A is called to play, no one answers, and the teacher goes up to the curtain only to find Rachel sitting there smugly, smiling about Lenny's escape. Rachel is now the first chair. Lenny ran to the forest, and once again is thinking about her and Bailey. In the memory, Lenny is playing clarinet, and Bailey is dancing with her hands, lying on the bed next to Lenny. Back in the real world, we see that Sarah is wondering where Lenny is and she sends her a text. Lenny ignores Sarah and continues her path through the forest, but she hears Joe running up to her. She stops, shocked, and asks if Joe has followed her all the way from the band. Joe jokingly says that he didn't follow her, but rather went for a run in a creepy forest with his guitar on his back. They laugh about it and Joe remarks about the enormously tall trees in the forest. Joe offers Lenny to practice together, as they will be both applying to the Juilliard school, but Lenny quickly turns away and says she won't be applying, and is disgruntled by the fact that everyone asks her about it. Joe says that he knows how she feels about losing her ability to play, that he also experienced that, and proposes that they play a duet. Lenny has a breakdown, and almost crying, insists that she doesn't play with him and quickly runs away. The same day, Lenny walks to Bailey's tomb and finds Toby already there. They both agree that no one really understands them and what they are going through with the loss of Bailey. We see another memory of Lenny's, from the funeral of Bailey, when Graham is saying the epitaph as everyone applauds. Back from the cemetery, Lenny and Toby seem to be beginning to like each other, and Lenny hugs Toby goodbye. As she hugs him, a little accident happens and she can feel his erection. They awkwardly bid farewell, and the same evening Lenny is chatting with Sarah about it, both excited and puzzled about how she should feel about Toby since he is the ex-boyfriend of her deceased sister. We see another memory of Lenny and Bailey, where Bailey shares with Lenny that she lost her virginity to Toby. Bailey expected her sister to be happy for her. However, Lenny quickly mutters congratulations and clearly shows she is jealous that Bailey spends more time with her boyfriend than her sister. The same evening, back in the present time, Lenny is again in Bailey's closet with her clothes on. Toby comes again, and they sit together on the steps. After a few moments of silence, Lenny breaks it by saying that Toby could be more talkative. Toby admits that he proposed to Bailey, and they were going to tell Lenny about it the week Bailey's accident happened. Lenny is angry about that, because her sister didn't tell her, and they had planned to move to New York together. After a few moments, she realizes that it's not her speaking, but rather her jealousy, and apologizes to Toby. Toby understands her pain, and as they are looking at each other silently, drawn together by their shared grief and enraptured in the emotion of the moment, they briefly kiss. Toby breaks off, regretting it instantly, and quickly goes away, leaving Lenny more puzzled than before. Once again, we're seeing Lenny's memories, where she shares that she always thought highly of her older sister and wanted to become her exact copy, taking the same pills, singing in her sleep as Bailey did, and so on. However, the beautiful scene of Bailey dancing on the street, as if it is the live show, ends with Lenny calling Bailey's old number and saying what she needs to, so Bailey will forgive her for kissing Toby. Lenny looks across the street and notices Joe, who is heavenly sunlit, playing his guitar softly. Lenny thinks it's a sign from Bailey and quickly runs to speak to Joe, but her uncle, Big, approaches her in a car and says he needs her help with his science. Meanwhile, Joe is joined by Rachel, who brings him coffee, and Lenny is really disappointed in her and Joe. As they are riding, Lenny realizes it's an ambush so Uncle Big can ask how she's doing. Len asks her uncle how they got through her mother's loss, but her uncle says they didn't, that she's still with them because of Len and Bailey. He raised them, and it helped him to last and endure the pain of losing his sister. They stop the car so Big can collect bugs from his front window, and as he's doing that, Lenny approaches him and asks if he believes in signs from beyond. Still troubled about the situation with kissing Toby, she asks what she should do if she did something terrible, and her uncle simply says she shouldn't do it again. However, Len says she really wants to, and her uncle realizes that she is talking about some love situation, but doesn't realize it is about Toby. The next day, Lenny goes to Joe's house to collect her clarinet, but Joe isn't there, and his brother lets Len in to find it herself. Len starts to fool around with Joe's things, and almost gets caught by Joe coming in with Rachel, but quickly escapes through the window. Len shares with Sarah that Joe was playing her clarinet, but Lenny quickly changes the topic to Toby, and worrying, her eyes running back and forth, says that she kissed Toby. Sarah is both surprised and disappointed with this fact, and she tells Lenny that she's changed, and she doesn't like the new Lenny. Lenny is offended by such words coming from her best friend, so she gets up and quickly leaves. Once Lenny gets back to her house, she's once again drowning herself in Bailey's old clothes and waiting for Toby to come. When he arrives, Len quickly goes outside to meet him. They quickly run to the forest, where Lenny once again talks about Bailey, almost having a panic attack, so Toby hugs her to comfort her. The next day, we see that Len is trying to play clarinet again. As she tries to do that, memories of Bailey and Toby flash through her mind, and she drops the clarinet and goes back to the forest, where she can feel herself alone and comfy. Later, Lenny is back at home with Graham and Uncle Big, eating ice cream, when Graham offers to go on vacation, so they can have a little rest, and perhaps it would help Len to ease her pain. While Len is disgruntled by such an offer, Joe knocks on the front door. Lenny asks Graham to not open the door, but not wanting to be rude, she says she will let Joe in. Joe is smiling as Lenny approaches the front door. He hands her a bag of sweets and says he offers peace, and explains that he knows she was in his bedroom. He also hands her one of her writings, which says, "Do you believe in signs?" and says he does, as he walks inside her house. Lenny feels euphoric, as she's really happy that Joe doesn't have anything serious with Rachel. They are sitting in the living room, Joe and Len, along with Graham and Uncle Big. Graham is constantly smiling and looking at Joe. Joe notices sweet roses in the garden, and Big says they have one more plant that is wilting, the Lenny plant, and in case the plant doesn't make it, she will be next. When Joe asks if Big is Len's father, Graham says that her mother, Paige, was an independent woman, so she went to the sperm bank, instead of getting a husband. Lenny is embarrassed and walks Joe outside of the house. Joe thinks that Len's relatives are cool, but Lenny says they are weird. Joe tells her that he won't ask her to play a duet with him again, as she will be begging him in a moment, and starts to play his music. However, it doesn't impress Lenny and she still looks discontent about the idea of playing together. Joe's last melody, though, eventually wins her round and she melts like ice. After her quick dance, she asks Joe why he stopped playing guitar. He says that his girlfriend, a violinist back in France, cheated on him with the man who he thought was his best friend. He was unable to play any music for 6 months straight, but then he discovered Bach's music and started to listen to it around the clock, and he says he even had dreams of Bach's compositions. Len wants to try it as well, and they are sharing headphones and lying together on the grass listening to Bach. At this incredibly romantic moment, we're seeing into both of their minds, where roses start to bloom around them, showing us that they are clearly falling in love with each other, and they are feeling connected through the music. They suddenly both wake up from this daydream, and Joe admits that he's never heard this melody in such a way before. Lenny also says she felt like she was listening to music through Joe. They both want to listen to one more composition. However, their intentions are interrupted by Joe receiving a call from, allegedly, Rachel, and he says he needs to go. As he gets up, he says that he had a dream about Lenny, and Lenny forgets about the frustrating call. However, Joe says it was just the two of them playing music. Back at her house, Lenny climbs up to her room, only to find all Bailey's clothes packed and moved away. She is in shock and quickly runs to Graham, who is painting in the summer kitchen. With tears in her eyes, Lenny asks her grandmother how she could do this to her, but Graham defends her actions, claiming it was needed to do so, and Len needs to continue living her life and let Bailey go. Len is lying on the bed, calling Bailey's old number, just to hear her voice one more time on her voicemail. Next, it's a rainy day, and we see that Lenny is sitting in a cafe next to the window, and through it, sees Sarah working across the street. Len doesn't want to talk to Sarah, so she leaves the cafe and meets with Rachel, who mocks her and says she got the invitation to the Juilliard school. As she comes back, the day is sunny again, and she finds her Graham beating the dust off the old sofa outside. Joe is also there with his brother, and Lenny is really glad to see him. They all have lunch together outside, laughing and joking. Lenny still can't get a grip, and again ends up crying, trying to run into the forest. In her imagination, she runs through the forest, repeating phrases about her grief, but she falls through the door back to the real world, where Joe runs up to her, to quickly pick her up and ask if she's okay. She once again freaks out on him, but Joe tells her determinedly that he likes her, and that Rachel is just a friend of his, and he wants to play with her on the duet. Lenny, clearly relieved by this information, smiles as Joe tenderly lets her hair out of its ponytail. They are both back at her house, where she spots Toby looking straight at her. While Joe is trying to find out who Toby is, Lenny and Toby are approaching each other in an awkward, silent manner. Toby mentions that Len's hair is down, and Graham interrupts them by introducing Toby to Joe. Joe says he's sorry for Toby's loss, and quickly goes outside to his brother, leaving Toby and Len to each other. Toby, disappointed in Len, as he thought she could replace Bailey for him, leaves Len standing in the center of the house. Between Joe and his brother playing guitar, and Toby's abrupt departure, she really doesn't know what to do, so we find Len in her room, sending a request to Sarah to help her. Someone knocks on the door of Lenny's room, and she's hopefully thinking that it's Joe, and she can now introduce Joe to Bailey. However, once she opens the door, it's Toby again. He enters the room and approaches Len, but Len looks back at the mirror, sees Bailey next to Toby instead of herself, and says to Toby she is not her sister, and it's all wrong. Meanwhile, Joe runs up to her room, and all three of them find themselves in a love triangle. After a few moments of silence, Lenny says they were just going through Bailey's stuff, and Toby leaves quickly. Joe wants to ask what's wrong, but Len interrupts him with a kiss. Both excited and agitated, Lenny says to him to wait for her in the rose garden. She introduces him to the Truth Mobile, a car of her Uncle Big in which you should speak only the truth. They ride in it and talk about their relationships. They are both standing on a foggy coast, and Lenny shares that she didn't know that the worst thing in her life could happen at any time. Regardless, she says that the best thing can also happen by surprise. Life again seems to gain color for Lenny. She's constantly thinking about Joe. She puts up with Sarah, and they are both saying they missed each other and they should have been more understanding to each other. Meanwhile, Toby tries to have a talk with Lenny, but she's doing everything she can to evade any possibility of meeting with him. One evening, Lenny runs outside to meet Joe again, and Joe spots Toby looking at them from one of the house's windows. Joe questions what's wrong with him, but Lenny assures Joe that nothing is between her and Toby, and he's just getting over the loss of Bailey. On a sunny evening, Len and Joe are playing a duet. Len, unlike her previous attempts to play clarinet, plays it amazingly, so well that even Joe acknowledges the fact she's better than him. As they start playing together, in their imagination, they seem to fly around each other, meaning they are getting really connected through the music they play. After Joe drops her by the house, Lenny seems to be the happiest person in the world. But not for long, she again notices Toby in the garden. She runs up to her grandmother, painting in the summer kitchen again, and asks why Toby is always there. Devastated, she climbs up to her room, and while monologuing with Bailey's portrait, she has a mental breakdown, saying that she can't stay like this, and she's finally tired of grieving and needs to move on. When Graham joins her, she blames her for not being able to save Bailey, and runs out of the house, crying. While running, she spots her Uncle Big smoking pot, and blames him for not going forward with his life after losing his sister either. When she runs up to Toby outside in the garden, she shouts at him and asks him to leave her alone. Toby agrees with her, but she notices he starts to cry, and asks what's wrong with him. Toby, after a quick moment to gather his thoughts, finally admits that Bailey was pregnant, and they were going to have a baby. Discovering this disturbing truth, Len wants to comfort him, and hugs him, leading into a kiss. After a few moments, Lenny turns her head to the rose garden and notices that Joe saw everything and now is walking backward, heartbroken, unable to believe what he just saw. Lenny frantically denies everything, saying that he's got it all wrong, but Joe doesn't believe her, says he knows what he saw, and leaves her standing there, distraught. Toby approaches her, says that he's sorry about it, and also leaves, leaving her face to face with her thoughts alone. Lenny, again back to her grief, sniffs Bailey's old clothes, but to her surprise, she discovers that they smell like her now. She can't believe it, and calls Bailey's old number, only to find that it's unavailable and no longer in service, so she can't hear her sister's voice anymore. She's in her room, playing the song Joe brought her previously, and she plays it perfectly, as Joe understands her, just like her older sister did. The following day, Lenny is in Sarah's room, deciding what to wear to impress Joe so they can make up. Also, she mentions she always felt like a second chair, and never saw herself as an identity, as a single whole. When Len arrives at Joe's house, she sees Toby also there. Joe doesn't speak to either of them, asks Lenny to leave him alone, and walks back to the house. Once the door closes behind Joe, Lenny asks what Toby is doing here. He says that for 2 days already, he has been trying to explain to Joe that there is nothing between them, and it was just a mistake of two grieving souls. Lenny, still unsure how she feels about Toby and everything that's happened, thanks him. Toby offers her a ride home, but she only agrees if they won't speak during the journey. Lenny, back at home, trying to get her thoughts together, looks into the rose garden and a bright idea pops up in her head. She cuts as many roses as she can, makes a bouquet out of them, and goes back to Joe's house. However, to her surprise, instead of Joe, Marcus, his brother, opens the door, says the bouquet is magnificent, takes it inside, and closes the door right before Len's nose. Joe comes out and shouts at her to stop coming, saying he doesn't need her, the person who betrayed him just like his first girlfriend did, and asks her once again to leave him alone. Lenny is absolutely devastated, as she anticipated them to reconcile, going back home alone. When Len comes back home, Graham's already waiting for her there, to ask angrily how she could do that to her roses. Graham approaches her and says that Len is ignorant of other people's feelings and thoughts, thinking she is the only one who's hurting. Lenny didn't think about her actions and immediately apologizes to her grandmother, saying that they need to spend more time together from this moment forward. They finally speak to each other about the problem of grief, accepting the fact that you can't revive people and that life must go on. Lenny is playing the clarinet in her room, the way she knows best. The performance is incredible, and that being said, we discover that Lenny has eventually gotten over the grief of her sister's loss. Len, fully confident in her abilities and capabilities now, walks to Rachel's house to challenge her again for the first chair. To Len's surprise, Rachel admits that Lenny is a way better musician than she is. Early in the morning, with the help of Marcus, she sneaks up to Joe's room and wakes him up. She apologizes to him and also says she loves him more than anything and invites him to fly a balloon with her, so they can make up with him in a romantic way. But Joe seems to be still upset about this situation with Toby and forces her to leave. After some time thinking, Joe realizes he is an idiot for not forgiving Lenny and giving her a second chance, so he asks Sarah to take him to Len. Meanwhile, Lenny is talking to her Uncle Big, standing next to the balloon. As it's almost 7 a.m., due time to go, her uncle says that Len should get in so they can fly without Joe. However, almost at the last moment, the car with Joe, Sarah, and Marcus inside comes into Len's sight. Len begs Big to get the balloon down, but he can't do it, because they are already flying up. Joe jumps up and clings to the taking off balloon, and Len pulls him in. Lenny discovers from Joe that he was collecting all the papers and signs she left while thinking about Bailey, thus enabling him to write a love melody for her. As the movie ends, we see that Lenny is going through her catharsis. Life's getting bright for her once again, ultimately accepting the fact that Bailey is gone, and that the end of life is inevitable. She chooses to cherish every moment, as it could be her last.